Did you know that each year more than 1.5 million North Americans are going on short-term mission trips? My name is Mark Adams, and in my Doctor of Ministry program at Lipscomb University, I studied short-term missions, and today I'd like to share with you some insights I gained about best practices that we can have to get the most out of our short-term mission trips. The growth of short-term missions has truly been staggering. Some of the earliest numbers reported were in the mid-1900s. In 1965, it was reported that 540 North Americans went on some sort of a short-term mission trip. But presently, as I mentioned, the number seems to exceed more than 1.5 million people. We're putting enormous amounts of resources into short-term missions, and a lot of people have been blessed through these experiences, both those who go and those who receive, but also those who send. Short-term missions are a relatively new field of study, and there have been some scholars who have rightly raised some concerns about the kinds of things that are happening on the trips. The trips that we're making, are they actually producing long-term benefit for the places that we're visiting? Are more people actually coming to know Christ? Are the people who go really being transformed and changing their lives so that they are more devoted, better missionaries at home? These are a lot of important questions people have been asking, and I'm excited to talk to you about some of the research that has occurred, which has given us better insights into how to make sure we do these things as well as we can. But along with the growth of the short-term missions movement, another thing we've been observing is the growth of the missional church movement. And the missional church movement, in a nutshell, it comes from where a lot of Western Christians have assumed for many years that when you think of a missionary, you generally think of an American. But we're seeing our own countries in the West gradually declining in terms of people participating in the Christian faith. And so suddenly, people who'd been on the mission field for years are having to start looking at our own homes, our own contexts, as mission fields. The missional church movement has grown in an effort to try and answer those questions of how do we start looking more like missionaries in our own churches and in our own backyards. So in my research, I saw a great opportunity to marry these two areas of study. Because after all, what better place to practice being a missionary than on a short-term mission trip where you're out of your comfort zone in a new place, pushing yourself to try new things, but then also thinking about how is it that we do become more like missionaries in our own settings. And so for my research, I was able to look at members of my own congregation, those who went and then also those who stayed, who helped to send the rest of us on our trips, and did some original research to see what these experiences were like, looking especially for missional impulses, things that the missional church movement would identify as kind of signposts, things that consistently seem to be missional behaviors. And so I was able to study that and observe that. What I'm going to try and do with this video is that I want to speak to three different segments of people involved in a mission trip. There are, of course, the receiving locations where we are sending trips, the people on the receiving end of all the resources and the work and the visits. There are the people who go. There are the people who travel on these mission trips, who do fundraising, who prepare and try to do the best they can while they're in another setting. But another often unstudied group of people are those who don't go on the mission trip, but who help to send others on mission trips. Those who help provide the funding, the prayer, the support, they rally around them, they help gather enthusiasm so that others can go and have these profound experiences. I'm going to talk a little bit about all three of those. Let's talk first about those who receive. My favorite story is an uncomfortable story, but there's a story about a location, I believe it was in Africa, and there was a Western group, an American group of short-term missionaries who went to visit this one little village in Africa. And as they arrived, they said, "We're here to serve you, we're here to help, and just tell us what it is you want done and we're going to help with it." And so the African leaders in this little village talked to each other a little bit, and they came back to the missionaries and said, "You see that big structure there in the middle of our village? And they looked, and it was easily the largest structure anywhere nearby. Huge, had an enormous roof. It was all covered. They said, yeah, that nice structure. They said, yeah, we would like for you to tear that down. And the missionary said, sure, we're here to serve. We'll do whatever it is you want us to do. And as they went and started working on disassembling this enormous structure, they could tell that it wasn't that old. It wasn't aged. There wasn't decay. There wasn't rot. There wasn't damage or leaks. And so after they'd begun disassembling it and done a lot of work on it, they finally came back to the Africans in the village and said, this structure is clearly new. Why is it that you're having us tear it down when it obviously wasn't here very long? What is it that made you decide to build it in the first place? And they said, oh, well, it wasn't our decision to build it. They said about 2 weeks ago, there was another group of American missionaries, and when they saw us worshiping under the tree where we always have worship, they just decided to build this big structure. We don't know why it's here. We didn't ask for it, and really we don't want it. It's kind of in the way. So thank you for tearing it down. So that's a good story about the problem we can typically have in working with people at another location. It is so important that we listen, really listen to people where we're going to serve. If we want to make a difference for the people in the receiving location, all mission trips need to begin with very thoughtful questioning, listening to what it is the people say will actually help them. So just because you want to go down there and paint houses, or just because you want to build a basketball court or whatever else, if that's not what's actually helpful to them, you shouldn't do it. This also highlights another issue that a lot of people don't consider, which is the issue of power dynamics. Do you realize that if you're going to visit, say, one of your missionaries in another country, if they know they're depending on you for their income and support, you're their lifeline in a lot of ways. If they know they're depending on you for these things, there's some power dynamics in place that could make them really uncomfortable to voice dissent or dissatisfaction. So if they see you're doing something and it's hurting rather than helping, if they know you're the guy that signs their paychecks, they could be really nervous about telling you that something is a problem. But if we go down there and what we're doing is causing problems, in fact, we're not helping at all. We're making things worse for them. So when you're going to work with a receiving location, if nothing else, make a real effort to listen to what their needs are. That has to be a starting place. And I'm going to link some resources down in the blog post to some good books you can read about how to make sure we're serving with eyes wide open, so to speak, and also helping rather than hurting. Very important to consider what kinds of help do they actually need. If they've been through a major natural disaster, you might need to bring emergency supplies, but you may be working with a culture that people are doing kind of okay. And if you were to bring down a bunch of emergency soap and toothpaste or something, you would go to a lot of trouble to bring it, but for them it might not even be something that they're needing. So to take things a step further, there's been some good research that's been done in several countries, certainly in Peru, where congregations who've gone on these mission trips have started asking bigger questions. So, for example, you've been to Honduras 15 different times, and all 15 times the same places you're going are still impoverished and nothing is getting better, and you show up for a couple of weeks to do your VBS and maybe patch up a couple of houses or something. We need to start asking the bigger questions. Why is this community staying impoverished? Why are things not getting better? What is it that we could emphasize or draw attention to that might actually help this community start to get themselves out of poverty? Because often, in order for someone to have space in their life to want to hear the gospel, you have to first address some of their immediate material needs. And that might take something more substantive than just bringing a few supplies down to last them for the next month. So there have been some great success stories of, for example, a congregation who was working with a mountain community in Peru that was systematically getting just dumped on by the city. They were putting trash. It was ruining the community. It was affecting lots and lots of people. And so this missionary group started renting billboards, getting signs, drawing attention to the greater problem, and managed to rally the whole region together around that community in the mountain. And they, sure enough, stopped the city from dumping trash and garbage and toxic things. It made the community nicer. It actually made everyone's lives better. But because of an ongoing relationship where the people going were paying attention to their surroundings, we're trying to invest in making all things better over time, it produced a lot of positive results. That's a short-term mission trip you could look at and say, sure, there has been long-term benefit to that. It's also good as you go down to think about trying to develop a relationship with one location. Now, truthfully, it is so much more fun to do a mission trip that's just scattered all over the place, where this day we're going to go to a hospital, and the next day we're going to build a house, and the next day we're going to go be with sick people and give out donations. It's kind of fun to do all that random stuff. But in terms of what we know can actually bring about change, it's best when relationships happen, where you know the people you're going to work with, they know you, and over time they've built up to the point that they can be honest with you about what their needs are, what's helping them, what they're able to use to reach people, and then you can tailor your efforts in such a way that the trips you're making, you can be confident, are going to be of genuine benefit to the people who are receiving you. So those are a few comments about receiving locations. Let's talk a little bit about people who go on mission trips. For me, I can say truthfully that my experience on my first short-term mission trip to Honduras in 1999, it was a watershed moment in my life. Everything in my life after that point, I see differently than I did before that experience and before that point. So I want to talk some about how we make sure people who go on our trips are getting the most out of the experience. I think this all begins with the leaders of the trips. If you're going to be a short-term mission trip leader, you really need to think about what kind of presence you're having as a leader. What is your mentality? What is your focus? Because you need to be modeling the very things you want other people to imitate. This begins in part in the way that you talk about what the trip is. I personally really push back anytime I hear someone say something like, hey, we're going to bring Jesus to Costa Rica. We're going to bring Jesus to Africa. Jesus is already there. Jesus is already working. In fact, he's been preparing good works. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 10 says, God's been preparing good works so that we can walk into them, basically. So God is the one who is preparing the mission fields. God's already there. It doesn't help for us to talk like, we're going to bring Jesus with us as if he's never been there. And here in the space of a week or 2 weeks, we're going to save the whole country. Those are all unrealistic expectations, and it's not helpful to talk in such grandiose language. A much better way to speak about your mission trip is to say, we already know that God is at work in these people's hearts and lives, trying to restore them to himself. And so it is our privilege to be able to go down, to witness, and to take part in the things that God is doing in this other location. Better to talk in those kinds of terms. Another thing that's important for mission trip leaders is that when you're working on your schedule of what you're going to do, obviously we've already talked about listening well to the receiving location, but you've got to have some downtime built into your schedule so that people can process what they're experiencing and take something back from it. So if you put together a mission trip schedule that every day you begin at 6:30 a.m. with breakfast and you have your final Devo at 11:30 at night with zero downtime in between, barely time for a shower, it'll only take about 3 days before all your team members are all kind of at each other's throats because they get so tense. I mean, people do need recovery time, they need rest time, and if they're not accustomed to working that hard in the States, they're certainly not going to be able to sustain that for a long period of time on the mission trip. So I'm a big advocate for making sure you've got some space somewhere. For us, that's a space built into the afternoon. We get a 2-hour break in the afternoon where everyone can take a shower. I encourage them to spend some time in Scripture. I provide everyone with trip journals with daily journal questions to help them process what it is they've been experiencing each day. But make sure you give them space so that they can keep themselves focused on why they're here. Just the same way that we in our own context, if you don't ever make time to slow down and to pray and to refocus your life, you get scattered and you get off focus. And just because you're on a mission trip doesn't mean you'll do any better if you don't have time to recover and refocus. So when you're on the trip, be sure that in your schedule you have space set aside so that as a group you can process what it is that you've seen God doing, the ways that you've seen God working through your team, the things that you admire and appreciate about each other. When you set that kind of a tone for your trip, it just makes a much better trip in every way. It's fun, having gone on one of these trips, to see people who push themselves out of their comfort zones. You'll undoubtedly have people on your mission trip who do some things they never would have believed that they could do, which suddenly they discover they have a new passion for. I've seen several of my members go from being very shy and not even wanting to serve publicly to discovering they actually were a pretty good song leader. I've had young girls who'd never done any manual labor in their lives who suddenly decided that they might just have been born to do construction work. They really enjoyed it. So it's fun to see some of the things that people learn to do and to ask those questions about, now that you know this about yourself, now that you've uncovered this about yourself, what are you going to do with that once you get home? It's a good thing to be asking about. So now I want to talk about the third and most often neglected group of people connected to a mission trip. And that is the people who send others on mission trips. There's very, very little research that's been done in this area. In fact, as of the time of my dissertation in 2016 that I could find, I was the only really academic level research that had been done on this subject. What about the people who not receiving missionaries? What about the people who are not going on the trip, but the people who stay and help others to go on a trip? And so for my research, I had a group of 23 people at my congregation that I did extensive interviews both before and after our mission trip. 75% of these were people who did not go on the mission trip. So I would ask them some general questions about how they saw God at work in our church. And so I had 4 questions. The first 3 were more general, and I would just kind of see where they went with them. And then the 4th question, I would follow up with specifically a question about the mission trip. Do you think God is working on our church through this mission trip? If so, in what ways? But I didn't want to lead them too early to the mission trip as a point of emphasis. But what was interesting for me was that of all the people that I interviewed, of those who didn't go, 38% of them mentioned the mission trip as a major way that God was working on our congregation, even without me bringing up the mission trip. That was pretty significant. And as we started talking about the trip itself, I learned a lot about where it is that the trip can make an impact. So I moved to King's Crossing Church of Christ in 2014. The last time that the congregation had made a mission trip was in 2012, and it was in fact the first mission trip they had ever made down to Costa Rica to visit the missionary family that they've been sponsoring now for almost 30 years at this point. But one of the things that I learned is it is absolutely possible that your congregation can have a short-term mission trip going on that makes virtually no impact on the sending congregation. So in 2012, the way that this unveiled, everyone decided that they needed to make a trip down to Costa Rica. I think the funding of the trip was provided entirely, if not almost entirely, from just church resources. So for the teenagers they wanted to send, they just simply paid for them to go. There was not a fundraising component. There was no send-off effort, and then after they got back, there was no trip report. Most people had kind of a vague sense that a mission trip had happened, but in terms of how did it impact us at home, it truthfully didn't all that much. Some of the ones who had the experiences could talk positively about our missionary at that point, but there just wasn't the level of impact that is possible when we do things well. What I learned from my research is that for those who don't go on the mission trip, it's everything that surrounds the mission trip where they really can have a positive impact and receive a lot of encouragement and growth from the experience. So it begins with all the things you're doing in preparation for the trip. I've come to discover that one of the best things you can do for your congregation is to have mission trip fundraising events. We've had a lot of fun with these. A couple of examples of things that we do at King's Crossing. Every year we have a chili cook-off competition. So everyone who wants to try and make a pot of chili will bring a pot of chili. We have a contest and people will vote on the best overall chili. But then as part of that, we also do a silent auction. So I have people donate items that are worth something decent, and then we'll set up a huge table with all the items, and people can go around and on sheets they'll make bids on who wants some of those items available. And all of that helps us raise funds for the mission trip. But it's useful because it gets all of our members thinking about it. There's something positive and something fun that brings us together, but they're already beginning to think about the work that we're going to be doing on the trip. And of course, part of the chili supper is us talking about our plans for the upcoming trip and some of what it is that we're hoping to do. Another event we've done that's really been wonderful started a couple of years ago. I tried to give it the stupidest name I could think of, and so we called it the Cornball extravaganza. All right, so pretty cheesy. But what this is, we serve for a meal these Mexican-style elote cups. It's a kind of a Mexican junk food, snack food, where you can either get a corn on the cob. We like to do corn in cups just because it's easier to kind of get a lot of it and serve it. And then you have several toppings that people use to make their corn bowls. And so we have people make donations for their corn bowls. But the other component of this is that we have a corny joke telling contest. And so people all show up prepared with their best 2 or 3 clean, cheesy jokes. And we have 4 categories. There's adult, male and female, and then youth, male and female. And at Amazon, you can buy these really neat corn hats. So we'll give a corn hat to each of the winners of the joke telling contest. Meanwhile, we also have a dessert silent auction. So a lot of the ladies and men will make their best dessert, pies, cakes, cobblers, and people will bid. And whichever one goes for the highest price, we declare that person the winner. And so also at Amazon, I bought a pie hat that we'll give to the person who wins that competition. Again, all of this helps raise money for our mission trip, but the very important function that it plays in the life of our congregation is it gets people of all ages together. We're doing something that's fun, we're laughing, we're enjoying each other, and it helps to promote a great sense of community among our congregation. Now that's just talking about the fundraising aspects. I'm also a large advocate for, as you're preparing to leave and then while you're on the trip, do some things to help keep people connected to what's going on. So the Sunday before the trip, make sure you get the whole team up on stage, have the elders up on stage, surround them, everyone pray for them, pray for their work. And then another thing that I do is I provide for everyone who's donated, I send them one in the mail, and then for every member present on that send-off Sunday, we'll provide a day-by-day calendar of things to be praying for. So we already know what we're going to be doing each day of the trip, or at least what we're intending to be doing. And so I have the team members divided up so that each day there's a couple of our team members that everyone is praying for. And then I have them praying for some of the specific work that's going on. So if we're having a gospel meeting on certain days and a VBS on other days, or some kind of event with the church, I try to always list those out. So the people who are interested can stay connected in praying for us and the things that are happening. Along with this, these days, it does depend somewhat on where you go, but if you're going to be at a place where you have sufficient internet access, it's a great idea to have someone in charge of making regular posts. You can do this as a blog post, which works, but I'm a big fan of using your church's Facebook fan page, Instagram page, and post pictures of what's happened that day. So every day, try to give people a summary of your team in action so that as it's happening, they feel like they're staying connected to the work that's occurring. And it makes it easier also for them to remember to be praying about it if they're on some of those social media channels. So that's some stuff you can be doing in preparation for the trip and while you're on the trip. But it's also critical that once you've gotten back from the trip, you take the time to give a really good report. Pictures, video clips, a thorough description of some of the kinds of things you were doing, and make sure you don't get so bogged down in details and statistics that you fail to put a face on what's happened. So you definitely want to spend time talking about individuals from the place that you visited who inspired you. So who were some of their great leaders? Who's someone in their congregation going through a significant struggle that you were with and prayed for while you were there? What's the life like of the missionary or the preacher or whoever where you're visiting? The person who's leading in that community. What are some of the specific things we could be doing for them and praying about for them? So these are all some really important areas to consider in getting the most out of your trip, especially for those who are not able to physically go on the trip. So it is the case that, again, you can make a short-term mission trip with very little to no discerning impact on the sending congregation. But if you try to involve them in all aspects of the trip, both in preparation to go, while you're there, and then after you've come back, you give them a proper, good follow-up. In fact, I recommend give yourself at least 2 or 3 weeks to spend time compiling your stories and best photos and do a really nice job on what it is that you present so that they know the things that they worked for and prayed about actually have made a difference. Another important part of follow-up is that especially for your leaders, you need to make sure you send some kind of a letter to every person who donated to your trip. Now, I keep track of every single check we've received, a name. If I know the names of donors, I keep track of every single person who helped make our trip possible. And every time I make sure I get at least a couple of good picture collages on little 4x6 photos that I can send to them. And I send them a letter and just give them all the details of all the ways that because they helped us make this trip, here are some of the things that God did. Here are some of the lives that were changed. Here are some of the souls that were saved. Make sure that you take time not just to report in the front of the auditorium, which you should, but also individually to everyone who helped to make your trip possible. I mentioned that part of my research, the purpose of the research, was to look at how a congregation's involvement in short-term missions could help the congregation become more missional at home. So going and practicing being missionaries helps us learn to live more like missionaries. So I wanted to share a few of the specific ways that I found short-term missions can help congregations become more missional. One of the things I would talk about where I saw impact at my congregation is what I would simply call sort of a missional awakening. I saw this especially in a couple of older participants. There were a couple of female participants in my research, both of whom were over 70 and, I'm being nice, probably over 80. And when I did interviews with them, they had been thinking a lot about the trip and praying about the trip, but it also got them brainstorming about what it is we could be doing at home. And so they each had lists prepared for me, and they started sharing all these ideas of new things they wanted to do to help us become more supportive of mission work. So some of these involved, could we do things like have a meal at our church where we serve traditional Costa Rican food so everyone can see more what it's like? Can we do a better job of putting out specific prayer requests and doing prayer partners from our church with members of the other church? They had a lot of different, just random ideas they'd been thinking of. But again, because we went on that mission trip and because they felt connected, it inspired them to have a more missionary type of imagination at home. That was one missional change. I would say that in 68% of the people that I talked to who did not go on the mission trip, this was one of the things that just emerged. I wasn't asking them, how are you more missional? I just said, what have things been like at church? And they just started sharing these missional ideas that they'd been having. So having a short-term mission trip at my congregation produced an increase among people I studied in some sort of a missional imagination or awakening. Of all my interviewees, 78% said they felt like the effect of our mission trip was that it really did help promote relationships within the congregation. They said this trip has brought us together. Everyone knows each other better. We're talking more. We're more focused on being missionaries at home. And in fact, one of the things I kind of find interesting, with any mission trip, you've always got the critics. There's always that person that no matter what you're doing somewhere else, they're going to start griping and saying, well, we really need to be doing more at home. And I've got a couple of people like that and have had them at every church I've been at. But what's fascinating to me is, even though they would tell you they're opposed to my trip and they think I'm wasting my time and I ought to be doing other things, the one thing that my trip is inspiring them to do is to think more deliberately about ways we could be missionaries in our own settings. So it's kind of, whether you love these trips or hate these trips, the trips are making you think more about what mission work needs to be done all around you at your home. So that's something that's certainly valuable. Another missional aspect that popped up in my research is the idea of what they would call prodigal relationships. Starting to form friendships and connections to people that you normally wouldn't think about associating with. So for those who go on these trips, it might be a lot of the people we meet while we're there. But it can be helpful that as you're putting these trips together, you try not to be doing things overseas that you're not also doing at home. So if we're going to go volunteer for an orphanage overseas, why don't we go ahead and give a test drive to some of our skits and things we're practicing at an orphanage somewhere nearby? Trying to connect what we're doing there to what we're doing here. But by going to new places and stretching ourselves to think about our own community, we get better at forming relationships with people who you would say are other than us, different than us. Short-term missions can help create that effect in a congregation. I also observed what I would call a higher narrative perspective. So whereas normally we're all just busy worrying about our own problems and running our own lives, When the mission trip was going on and people started thinking about the mission trip and what was happening, it's like they had an ability to kind of step up a little bit higher and look at things more from God's perspective. What's the bigger story going on here? What's the bigger thing that's happening over there? But also, what about in our context? What is it that God is preparing us to do? What is it that's supposed to be happening next that we're going to be part of? So God's used us there, but how is he also going to use us here? When people, even if they don't go, have opportunity to connect to your trip, these are some of the kinds of things that they'll be thinking about. Something you might think about in connecting your preparations to go to your local congregation is to look for ways that the things you're doing overseas can dovetail with your ministries at home. Earl Lavender shared with me a story about one congregation who had a powerful impact on their community. This was a small rural church who happened to have an ongoing mission trip to a Central American country. I don't remember which one. But one of the things they did when they were there was that they would go down there and they would construct houses. And they had developed a method for doing this where at their home congregation, they would buy the lumber and the supplies, and they would assemble these wall units. And after they'd assemble all these walls, they'd pack them up and they would ship them down there. And then once they got down there, they'd retrieve them, take them on site, and put them together. But they just started making these big work days at their church. And this was especially good for all the guys who are trying to find some way to serve. So many of our ministries involve things that guys are not generally good at, ministries of, writing cards or making meals or some of these kinds of things. And you got a lot of guys who just want to do something, they like to work with their hands. And so this was a great opportunity where many men who were not members of the church, but who lived in the community, they liked the opportunity to try and do something generous and kind for people in a disadvantaged part of the world. And so they started having these massive attendances of men from the community who wanted to come together and help build these walls to send down to Central America. And it was a path for many into the congregation. And so I thought that was such a powerful concept that as we're going about doing the work of God, one of the best ways to evangelize someone is not to try and hard sell them on Christianity, but instead to say to them, why don't you come along with me and do the things that Christians do? So we believe in helping the poor. We believe in being generous. We believe in being mission-minded. So it doesn't matter that you're not a Christian. Why don't you just come with us and help us assemble these walls to send down to Central America? And we would be better if you were part of us. We could do more good if you would come do good with us. That's a great way to be able to invite someone to involvement in your church and to get a little taste of what it is to follow the Lord. For our congregations to break loose from kind of boxed-in thinking, it's often necessary for there to be some kind of a disruptive experience that happens. So God can use these disruptions in our lives to draw us more closer to himself. And unfortunately, a lot of these disruptive experiences can be fairly negative. So the loss of a key leader or minister or a young person, someone moving away, some kind of tragedy happening physically to the community. There's a lot of bad things that can happen which can serve to disrupt things where better missional thinking can occur. One of the things I've really loved about short-term missions is that a short-term mission is a way that you can disrupt the normal flow of your congregation, but in a happy and a healthy way. Now, when the mission trip is going on, when people are preparing for it, and it's noticeable, it just has a way of shaking things up. And when we can create a positive type disruption, there's an awful lot of good that comes from having that happen within our churches. If you're interested in talking more about short-term missions, this is an area of great passion for me. So down below in the blog post and also in the description on the YouTube video, I'm going to have additional resources made available, and I would encourage you to click on those, read through those. But certainly, if you have any questions or feedback about best practices for short-term missions, it's an area of major research and passion for me. It's something I'd love to talk to you more about. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and also to follow us there at our website, kingdomupgrowth.com.